Hello, lords and ladies. This is For Extraordinaire, and we have a ton of exciting news for Dev Diary 64 Cultures Are Forever because, as the title kind of indicates, it is going to be all about cultures, and the devs just go into depth a ton about the different cultures affecting this expansion. And I'm not a shill for Paradox by any means, but this really does look like it's going to be a very beefy expansion. There are cultures for like every, there are traditions and like just different ethics and ethos for every single culture, it seems. So there's a lot of diversity here. So let's just get right into the dev diary. I'll try to explain some of what I've taken away. And I've also been playing CK3 recently a ton. Really got into it, surprisingly, and I love some of the mechanics. So I can't wait to see how this affects culture, and I'm just excited to see what we have in store. So the first main thing that can be taken away from this is that the cultures are being revised. Instead of just having one central hub where you have basically traditions, you have your innovations, there's actually several different pillars, up to something like 7 different ethos too that are included, and basically that determines the ethos is here, I believe, and that determines the direction your culture is going to be. If it's Bellicose, you're going to have a much more belligerent culture. It's going to be more focused around war. But if you're spiritual, it might be more focused around piety. If you're stoic, it might be focused around an entirely different resource, kind of like prestige. So that's kind of where the ethos are going. The individual culture pillars are also kind of similar. They take your culture in a different direction as well, and they kind of define your tenets. So one of my cultural pillars might be martial men only, so my men can only compete in combat, as far as I can tell from this. Or it might have like an individual language modifier. So it seems like the cultural pillars themselves are just a general loose collection of these different tenets, and then the traditions kind of go in a very specific way, in that they give your culture specific buffs, or they greatly buff a certain part of your culture, and they kind of define it. And then the innovations are an entirely separate technology. When we had these innovations before, but basically the innovations are different kinds of text for your culture. So if I wanted to get like gavel kind, it would be in an innovation, or if I wanted to focus towards Mott's and Bailey's, that would also be an innovation. So they're really separating these. The cultural tenets are being separated into traditions and pillars, and then the innovations are their own separate tech for CK3. Interestingly, you can also establish traditions. So if you're a cultural head and you have a ton of learning, learning seems to have been buffed massively in this update. So basically, learning can determine whether or not you would be the cultural head. So that is the same. But if you have high learning, you can also determine your fascinations, and you can also determine your tech. So that is going to be really, really important. You're going to want to focus on being the cultural head if you want to get things like Gavelkind or ascend to like Primogeniture. But you're also going to want to be the culture head if you want to kind of just continuing to develop your culture and take more of an active role in just adding new tenets and whatnot. But you do have to be careful because there's only so many traditions. There's up to 6 that you can unlock, as well as cultural pillars. So you really have to be careful in steering your culture, and I assume there's going to also be some pushback to that. So I touched on this earlier, but there is an ethos specifically for each kind of stance in the game, kind of similar to the different professions, and this will interact directly and indirectly with some of them, like learning and martial. So Bellicose is focused towards martial, and then you have some more broader ethos like communal, courtly, egalitarian, inventive, spiritual, and stoic. And basically each ethos is framed around a particular theme that somehow ties into a fairly broad definition of what a culture is. A culture's ethos not only provides effects and bonuses for having it, it also ties into how easy or difficult it is to acquire certain traditions. More on this further down. There are 7 in total. So here are some examples of the actual ethos and the pillars here. We have Bellicose. This is very military focused. You get more available mercenary companies. The specific culture this is being affected is the Cumans. All Cuman characters gain additional prowess. Men-at-arms recruitment cost is increased, or it's decreased, and then the maintenance is also decreased. So the levy size is increased as well. So this is going to be really, really helpful, especially if you have like dueling characters or you're really relying on mercenaries. And then there's spiritual. You're going to get additional monthly piety. Control growth is going to increase. And then faith creation and reformation cost is going to be cheaper. So if you're something like Catholic and you want to split off from that massive religion branch and you want to reform, and you're like a kingdom in more of its later stage, like after the early game, you just want to kind of centralize down, spiritual would be good if you want to just break off and kind of be your own ruler. If you want to be your own little battle pope, that is. Then we have Inventive. Of course, they haven't shown off all of the pillars. I assume they're still working on some of them, but these are still fairly interesting. Inventive is basically monthly lifestyle increase, cultural fascination progress. So this is going to be if you really want to kind of reinvent your culture, hence the name Inventive. And then it's also going to increase your development growth. So all in all, this is going to be kind of more of a passive buff in that you're going to be slowly growing. Well, not passive. You can be pretty I guess, adamantly inventive about your culture and kind of steering it around. But it's going to be more defensive. You're not going to be going around, I guess, and like collecting cultures one by one. This seems more like you're going to hunker down and just slowly develop your culture and just kind of see where that goes. And this kind of gives you the extra backbone to do so. So there's different individual subsets for the culture itself. So heritage, for example, a culture's heritage can be compared to the culture groups that you can be used to seeing in the existing system. And a lot of this is built off of the prior system as we discussed earlier. So heritage is basically our subsets of individual cultures. So if I have an Iberian heritage, actually, it's not going to be a subset. It's going to be like the one big culture, and then the individual kind of separate cultures like Basque or Catalan are going to be Castilian are going to be grouped into that, though I guess Catalan is also an Iberian heritage. Or if I have a Greek culture, maybe Byzantine or Anatolian is going to be grouped into that as heritages. So language also has a very interesting impact. It did not have any impact whatsoever, I don't think, in CK2 aside from like maybe one buff. Or like a trait, and then each culture has designated languages, and these vary greatly across and between empires, and they might actually prove to be individual challenges by themselves if you have to like translate different languages. So it's nice to see that these are being kind of put out on the forefront, and the game is acknowledging that there's going to be these cultural barriers, and you have to adjust to them as a ruler. And so basically what they're describing through language is they're kind of reshaping cultures and deciding how to group heritages and just really kind of showing and showcasing the different mechanics the game has to offer with the Royal Court. There's a ton of other interesting, neat little details in here, like the Noble Martial custom and then the aesthetics, which kind of determine the individual bells and whistles of your kingdom. I'll let you guys read this, as I'll link the dev diary in the description below. But again, this is a very, very beefy dev diary. It's very, very fascinating. I don't want to stall you guys for too long, but I just want to get to the important points and show you guys all that the dev diary has to offer. So traditions are fairly interesting in that they're very similar to the reforms, though they are a bit different in that you can have more of them. And by reforms, I mean in CK2 with the individual tenets for your religion when you kind of go through that Reformation phase. And basically, you can have these different cultural traditions, and you spend different sources of influence, kind of like prestige, to just reinvent them. And certain traditions also have certain requirements. So if you want to go for a more military-based tradition, you might need more knights or champions to kind of get your people to accept that. Or if you want like another tradition, you might need a certain trait or kind of profession, like a very high learning skill, or you might need to have like maybe a Templar trait or something related to that specific tradition to kind of get your court to go along with it and reform that tradition. So it's not going to be like, oh, I want to be extremely chivalrous, let me just go slap that down as I am a 3 martial character. You're actually going to have to kind of be similar to that trait. So you're going to need to be a lot more careful in terms of shaping your heirs and kind of planning things out, which is going to be very, very interesting in terms of the meta for CK3. And kind of, it's going to be interesting just to see how the game develops around these different cultures. And there are a ton of traditions, I just have to say. There's Land of the Bow, I guess, for the Nubians. There's Seafarers. There's Esteemed Hospitality. So there's going to be some general traditions, and then there's going to be some more advanced traditions. And then there's probably going to be even some hybrid traditions, which is going to be very, very interesting. And I should probably mention there are already hybrid traditions in the game, kind of like Woot Steel for the Norsemen and then the Indians. So I guess they're going to continue expanding on that, and it's going to be very exciting to see where the game goes from here. So one of the biggest things kind of binding the traditions and the different cultural beliefs together is cultural acceptance. If you want to get some of these traditions, and some of them may be in another culture, so maybe if the Occitans have a very early primogeniture tradition that I could possibly graft onto my culture, I would want to have a high cultural acceptance. But if I'm being very adamant and warlike towards the Occitans as the Franks, they're going to be much harder to assimilate. So I have to be very careful kind of about accepting these different cultures and their values. So I'm going to want to be careful towards some of these courtiers, especially if they're my vassals. I might want to send them gifts occasionally. And then I might even want to send, I'm not too sure if this is in the game specifically, but I might want to send my clerk or one of my council members that has high learning to kind of go work with the Occitans, improve diplomacy, and just kind of see how that works out with them. Another thing is that all cultures will have a baseline acceptance, and then there's other actions you can take to kind of improve your acceptance. But basically, heritages will start out, if they're similar in terms of culture, like if the Occitans and the French, they're kind of similar in terms of their culture, they might start out with a similar cultural acceptance, as opposed to like someone like a Han Chinese and then a Norseman who are going to start out at like 0. So depending on where the cultures are located, they might have a higher cultural acceptance, which makes them easier to integrate and kind of fuse with your own culture. So all in all, this is a super exciting dev diary. There's a ton of different reworks to traditions to cultures. This is definitely a huge, beefy dev diary, and I can't wait to cover more of it. So if you guys have liked the video, please let me know. This has been 4 Extraordinaire. This is kind of taking a new format. I want to do a bit more of a freeform style because you guys can just read the dev diaries, and I've just been basically reading the dev diaries for the rest of my previous coverages of CK3 and Victoria 3. So I'm trying something new, so if you guys like it, please let me know. Also, if you like the video, leave a like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more CK3 coverage. All right, love you guys. This has been 4 Extraordinaire. See ya.